and I'd like to welcome you all to In Conservation With. My name is David Lindo, and with me, as I said before, is the lovely Miriam Darlington. And how are you down there in sunny Devon?
In Devon, yeah, I'm very well, David, thanks, and it's really lovely to be here.
Good. You are actually originally from Surrey, from Lewes, and I was talking to you earlier. Lewes is a lovely, lovely town. How long were you there for?
I was born in Lewes and brought up there, and I spent the first 25, 30 years of my life in Lewes. So the South Downs are my kind of old stamping ground, really. It's still part of me. It's still in there. It's home, you know, Lewes. But I migrated to Devon purely for the otters, I'd say, probably.
So
there weren't any otters in Sussex at all.
Oh, otters actually drove you to Devon?
Absolutely.
Okay, we'll have to chat about that. We ourselves have known each other for a few years now. I can't actually remember the very first time I clapped eyes on you, but I know we've been to several things. We've been in several countries together. We've been to Serbia together. We've been to Spain together, and we've also hung out at the British Birdwatching Fair.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. I remember clapping eyes on you at Belgrade Airport with Milan Ruzic, the president of the Serbian Bird Protection Society, in about 2016, I think it was, when we were going to look for owls in Kikinda, but more of that later, probably.
Definitely. Looking at your kind of bio very briefly, I noticed that you are, first and foremost, according to what I've seen so far, a poet. Would you say that, or are you more a writer, or is there a distinction, or is there not a distinction?
Yeah, there's probably a bit of a distinction. I mean, I started out as a poet, and I kind of regarded poetry as my apprenticeship into writing, really. It's how I learned how to write a sentence and use imagery and connect with the reader through kind of sensory language. So I started out writing a lot of poetry when I was first kind of flexing my writer muscles and practicing and getting going. And I had my first collection published in 2008, and then realised there was absolutely no money in it. And so I decided to be a proper kind of jobbing writer, and moved into non-fiction writing. I did try and write a couple of novels, actually, but I'm not a very good fiction writer, and I've got a couple of novels kind of propping the underside of my bed up, but they never got anywhere, probably luckily.
So your poetry book was called Windfall. I mean, poetry is interesting because when I was a child, I never knew I could write at all. Maybe I still can't. But anyway, as a kid, I went to a not very good school, and they encouraged us actually to write poetry, which was really interesting. And I remember not so much writing poetry, but collecting poetry. I used to collect poetry on birds. And I go to the library and just copy all the poems down that have been written about birds by whoever, you know. And I attempted a few poems, but now to think about poetry, I wouldn't know how to start. In 2 seconds, what's the layman's way of getting involved in poetry, in writing poetry?
It's kind of, I would say, kind of, it's automatic writing. You don't think much about what you're going to write. You just have a line in your head and you start writing, and you stop before the end of the line. So, so instead of going all the way to the end of the page, you kind of stop a little bit before that. And poetry has a kind of musicality about it, but you don't realise it until you've finished writing. But it's also really based in fact and experience. So people like to write about their personal experiences, things that have been difficult to express, stuff that's really meaningful, experience, and it's got to be vivid and direct and alive. I mean, one of my favourite nature poets, John Clare, wrote a lot of bird poems, and some of his descriptions of birds are incredibly precise, and they've been used in bird books. I mean, he was writing in the 18th century, late 18th century, and his descriptions of the woodcock and snipe and so on have been used and put into facts in bird books. So poetry can be a very factual thing, and I think it's a kind of natural starting point for any non-fiction writer, actually.
And were your, I mean, do you still obviously still follow poetry, but do you like poets outside of, I mean, obviously outside of the nature fold? I mean, what poets influence you or make you feel great? You know, what are your favourite?
Well, John Clare was one of them, but he's quite an old-fashioned kind of rhyming poet of the 18th century, as I said, and one of the early romantics. And these days, I like to read kind of contemporary poetry, but I do still read a lot of nature poetry. So Kathleen Jamie is one of my favourite poets, but there's also a poet called Liz Berry who writes in her kind of Black country dialect, and she writes a lot about birds as well. She's one of my favourites. I love Alice Oswald, who lives near me on the River Dart, and she writes a lot about the local area. She's written a wonderful kind of epic poem about the course of the River Dart all the way from the source to the sea, and I particularly appreciated that, not only because I live here, but also because it's brilliant. And she speaks in all the different voices of people that live near the river. So she has kind of fishermen and poachers and swimmers and tourists and local people speaking in different voices in the poem. It's really interesting. So yeah, I still love poetry and I still use it as an inspiration.
Let's talk about your early days. I mean, how did you get into nature? What was the moment when you suddenly realised I'm into this?
I think, you know, for many people interested in natural history, it's got to be when they were children. My dad was is a biologist, although he's retired now, and he used to take me out into the countryside around where we lived and just point out what was there, you know, the plants, the insects, the snails, you know, the invertebrates. We used to look really closely at woodlice and spiders, and he'd name everything. And he had this kind of scientist's precision, and I developed a real love for knowing what things were. I wasn't happy just to look at a creature and think creepy crawly. I wanted to know what it was. And so he kind of instilled in me a real curiosity, a ferocious curiosity, actually. And I think I got it from him, and his family were all kind of natural historians and botanists and scientists and zoologists. And so I was brought up in this kind of environment with interesting objects and things. Like my grandfather's house was a kind of museum of skulls and stuffed animals and ancient dusty books on natural history that I used to get out. And, you know, we didn't have TV or the internet then. There was not much to do, and they used to just ignore me, and I'd be in the kind of in the lounge looking at all my granddad's encyclopedias searching for a picture, you know, which there weren't very many of. And so it's my dad and my granddad, and then my mum was more literary, and she'd read to me, and she read me Tarka the Otter when I was little, and I know that Henry Williamson, the author of Tarka the Otter, was like, he was a bit right wing, but it didn't come across in the story of the otter at all. And he's kind of disapproved of and not very popular anymore, but his writing really brought the natural world alive in a really magical way. And so he took you right down to the kind of the otter nose level of the water and underneath, and you sort of transformed into an eel as you were reading. It was an amazing book. And that also, so it was that kind of combination of stories about animals and my dad's kind of science fascination, and both of those combined was kind of had some kind of alchemical effect that kind of made me who I am as a writer, I think, and just gave me this curiosity and fascination.
I read somewhere that Tarka the Otter was actually quite a seminal book for you, wasn't it?
It was, yeah, absolutely. It gave me that idea of the creature and how elusive it is, and I went in search of the wild otter when I'd read the story. And of course, this was in the late 70s. I was about 10 years old, and I thought, I've got to go and see one of these animals, because I just read about it, and I went looking, and of course in Sussex in the 1970s, well, in the whole country, otters were nearly extinct, and there certainly weren't any otters in Sussex, where the rivers were all being managed. So I got this huge sense of injustice, and I was living inside this story on the one hand, where otters were alive and sympathetic and had character, and on the other hand, this countryside which had no otters in it at all. So yeah, it was really influential, and I started a little campaign of my own to ban otter hunting, and I produced a little publication called Otter News, with ferocious editorials about how it wasn't fair that there was otter hunting, and I had a readership of my whole street. So that was my early beginnings as a journalist. I've still got them. They're kind of very dusty and crinkly, but yeah, they're still there. Oh, I don't think it's fair that we should hunt otters. Poor otters. Not fair.
Did that kind of lead you to your first of your two nature books, Otter Country? Did that lead you to that, or was there a bit of a gap before that happened?
Yeah, there was a big long gap, because of course, you know, I grew up and discovered boys and got distracted, wasted an awful lot of time on that, had babies, went to university, and then, you know, I had a bit of time to think about things, and we moved down to Devon with a young family, and I thought, hang on a minute, you know, I can actually see wild otters now. So, and also what happened was, during that time when we were first in Devon, I got really ill with ME. I got a post-viral thing which developed into ME, and the only way I could kind of see my way out of that was being creative and walking along the river gently and kind of slowly getting better. And it was at that point that I really thought, actually, I could just give up. I was a school teacher at the time, and I thought I could just give up being a school teacher and write a book. And I had writer friends who used to send me kind of nature articles and inspiring stuff to read, and I thought, I can do this. And then I saw Mark Cocker's book, Crow Country, which came out, I think, in 2006, and it was about his obsessive quest to kind of discover more about the corvids, the crows and the rooks that lived around his house in Norfolk, in Claxton, his village. And I thought, I could do that, very naively. And about 8 years later, I had finished, hang on, Otter Country.
How did you start the research on that? What was the sort of first thing you did? What was your process?
Yeah, I think it was very different from how I write now. I'm kind of very fond of the Otter Country period of my career, actually, because when I look back on it, I completely immersed myself in searching for otters. And what I did was, I completely neglected my family. My poor husband, now ex-husband, was left holding the babies, and I got a camper van, and I just went in search of these otters. And I didn't just disappear. I did come back. I'm exaggerating slightly. I went off for a few days at a time, but it was very, very immersive. So I would go off and go swimming in rivers and camp out and sleep out until I found these dratted animals that are so difficult to see. And then as I got further into the book, into the research, I started kind of going a bit feral, and I gave up my car, and I gave up my mobile phone, and I left all social media, and I sort of became an otter. And I know that sounds a bit odd, but it was just what I wanted to do. And it meant that I did see quite a few otters, because I was very quiet and undisturbed and very focused. And I just wanted to bring this story back of what it feels like to see and to encounter and to get close to these animals. And I found people who could help me. I found, otter experts who knew good places to look, and what otter spraint, their droppings, look like, and how to track them, what their habits were. So I did get people to help me. It wasn't just a solo quest, because I was a complete amateur. And I wrote about them too, because I got really fascinated with these people who were spending their lives committed to otter conservation and so on. So in Otter Country, I do write about the people who work with otters too. And for example, one about 4 chapters in, I decided that I needed to find out about the Otter Project in Cardiff, where they scoop up all the otter corpses that are found on the roads and the dead otters that are found, and they freeze them all and they do post-mortems to find out their toxicology and so on. And I went to an otter post-mortem, which was slightly too much for me actually, because I'm very squeamish, and I thought I'll watch some episodes of Silent Witness and those vet programs where they do, and I'll be fine. And the smell of composting otter and the having to kind of open up the otter and lift, and they thought that I was going to help. They thought I was a science student going to help, and so they gave me a white coat which was all kind of splattered in blood, and said, right, you're going to weigh, what we want you to do is weigh the organs when we hand them to you, and then you can note down all the details. And I was like holding these otter spleens and lungs and an otter heart. How much does an otter heart weigh? And I was in pieces by the end of it, but it was a great story. Talk about immersion journalism. It was. When I read that part, when I was doing my book tour, the audience were going, it produces great emotion. But that's because it was a very kind of vivid experience. So it's about immersion, basically.
When you saw your first otter, what was that like, and where was it?
I wasn't seeing them in Devon. I knew they were there, so I got in my camper van and went up to the west coast of Scotland, where I knew that otters come out in daylight, because otters they're usually nocturnal, but they come out in daylight in Scotland and rely on the tides because they're coastal. So they rely on the tides more than nightfall. So I thought I'm much more likely to see one swimming in the sea. So I kind of snuck up on a few otters on the west coast, and because I was in my camper van, wild animals don't register stationary vehicles, as any sort of threat at all. So it's like being a hide. So I woke up one morning at 4 a.m. and it was midsummer, and there was an otter. I was actually woken up by the sound on my first morning of an otter crunching its way through a crab. I thought, what is that? And I looked out the window, and there's this otter crunching, splinters flying everywhere. It swallowed the whole lot, claws and all. So that was my first otter, and I was very, very excited. And after that, I kind of knew what to look for, because I'd seen how it moves, how this creature moves, how it goes into the water, what it looks like under the water, leaving a bubble trail and so on. So that experience in Scotland was really kind of formative for me.
I saw my first otter in Scotland as well, actually. Hander Island, or maybe the Summer Isles, around that way anyway, in West Coast, when I was a teenager.
Yeah.
It was pretty special.
You never forget it, I think.
I suppose in writing that book, you must be the world's expert on otters, and you must have some interesting facts.
I've got some interesting facts. I'm certainly not I'm not a scientist, so I'm not the world's foremost expert, but I just know, I know what to look for. I took my partner down to the river and said, look, I'm going to show you some otter poo. And I knew exactly what, and he was like, well, first of all, how, and then why, and then why would I be interested? I took him to this spot, and I knew exactly where the otters would have been and what was in the otter spraint and so on. So, yeah, I've learned a lot of skills, but I'm not a conservation biologist, and I wouldn't make any claims.
So how long do otters live for?
Well, in the wild, not very long. I mean, they might only breed once, you know, they might only live 2 or 3 years. In captivity, probably more like 15 years, you know, when they're having a cushy life and they're being fed and protected. But what happens to most otters is that they get hit by cars. You know, cars are their biggest predator. So, and it's how we know they're there as well, because we never see them. You know, finding an otter corpse by the side of the road is kind of a good sign, because, you know, well, at least there are otters here. But yeah, cars are their new predator. We don't hunt them anymore. We just, you know, get them at rush hour, unfortunately.
And what's the situation with otters now in 2020?
Well, the last I heard, certainly in Devon, where otters are doing really well because there are plenty of unpolluted rivers. In Devon, they're at capacity. So everywhere I look, when I'm searching for signs of otters, on the smallest stream to the biggest river, and even on the coast, there are otters everywhere. That's not to say there are lots of them or that they're common. They're just widespread. So they've recolonized where they died out from. And Northumberland is another very good place, you know, because all the rivers in Northumberland kind of go down to the coast, and otters can kind of find each other along the coast and up rivers. So, but I think there are otters now in every county in England and Wales. In Scotland, they're pretty widespread as well, obviously. But they've really made a comeback. They're doing probably as well as they can. It's still a rare creature, but they've kind of got everywhere they can, and they've succeeded in recolonizing where they were before they started being poisoned out of existence by the use of DDT and agricultural pollution and so on.
It must hearten you when you hear about urban otters as well. It's amazing to, you know, see them in London and you know, Norwich and places like that as well.
It's absolutely brilliant. I remember going up to the Olympic Park, you know, in 2012 when the Olympics were on, just before the Olympics started, and they built otter holts on I think it was the River Lee, which was so badly polluted, you know, a few years ago that it was poisonous, it was toxic. Yeah, there are otters in places, you know, running about in the streets of cities and towns, and they often come out at night in cities, but they've been seen in the rivers in Thetford and in Dorset and all over, you know. So yeah, the urban otters, people don't realise they're there often. Which I find a completely delightful fact. People's otters in the, you know, wow, I saw an otter. People are amazed, but they seem to be getting everywhere.
Yeah, it's funny because I'm sort of in Spain at the moment, as you know, but otters are fairly, I kind of see them fairly regularly, even in the middle of Merida, the city I'm in now. You know, if you go there, even during the course of the middle of the day, you might see one just swimming down a river, not minding anyone else at all, just getting on with its own business, which is quite good. Have you ever kind of had the urge to broaden yourself out and try and see more species of different species of otter around the world?
Oh yeah. Well, do you know what? I think there are something like 13 species across the world. You know, there are the North American otters and sea otters in California, and there are all sorts of different otters, Asian short-clawed otters and otters in South America. But actually, I was happy with the British otters. That was it. You know, once I got to know this species in this country, the Eurasian otter, yeah, I was happy. I didn't need to go travelling. It was a kind of a very British book, you know. Alsense, my next book was a very European book, but Otter Country, yeah, I was kind of satisfied with that. I mean, it may be something to do with the fact that I did actually have a young family and I didn't want to take too much time away from them, but also that I just completely fell in love with the British Isles and its wildlife.
Yes.
And that sort of felt like enough, which is actually really comforting now because we can't go anywhere, and I know that there's a wealth of stuff to see here that could keep you going forever, really.
Yeah, it's amazing. Britain's amazing.
Yeah.
Asked a question, I don't know if you can answer it, but with the increase in beavers now in the wild, what will that have an impact on the, I think she's talking about the otter populations, yeah. Will that have an impact on the otter population, do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, it'll only have a good impact. Beavers are kind of landscape engineers and ecosystem improvers, and the reason they're being now, there's been a big study, and the reason they're being released and doing so well in the places they have been is that they improve the environment. They create wetlands which are enormously beneficial for the whole ecosystem, from invertebrates to fish to mammals to birds. So otters will benefit from that, and otters and beavers inhabit separate niches in the ecosystem. So an otter is a predator and it's a carnivore, but beavers are herbivores, and so they can busily chop down trees and make dams and improve the environment for fish. So otters and beavers can cohabit reasonably happily. In fact, I've seen them together in the same lake. So I mean, they might battle. Otters are very inquisitive, and they might find their way into a beaver lodge, but I should think the beaver would see an otter off. I mean, I think beavers are quite a bit bigger than otters, and it's not very wise to pick a fight with something that's bigger than you if you're a carnivore. So they will cohabit pretty well. It'd be really interesting to see. I'm fully in support of the beaver projects. Yeah. Very exciting.
Beavers are really fascinating. I've only ever seen one in my life, and that was in Latvia, and that was a magical moment because it was actually at dusk, and I just noticed something floating down a creek, and it turned out to be a beaver, and it was like amazing. Anyone in any of the Zoomers here do you have any questions regarding otters or anything else we've just spoken about for Miriam? Yeah, okay, all a bit shy. Okay, well, I think that leads us quite neatly onto book number 2, which, oh, you haven't had one? Oh, okay, cool. Owl Sense.
This is actually a proof copy, so it hasn't, yeah, but anyway, that's it. That's basically what it looks like without the gold. It was sparkly when it came out in hardback, it's very nice.
So for those who don't know what Owl Sense is about, could you give us a bit of a synopsis?
Yeah. Oh, Viv's holding hers up there. Well done, Viv, my loyal fan. Owl Sense was a very different book from Otter Country, although the driving force behind it was the same, in that I got curious. I mean, when I get curious about something, I sort of can't let go until I found out everything there possibly is that I could possibly find out. And Owl Sense was about finding out about the local owls that lived near me, barn owls and tawny owls. And then I realized that, of course, there are all these other species of this amazing creature, little owls, short-eared owls, long-eared owls, a snowy owl, which is a kind of vagrant that blows in some winters and springs, and occasionally the eagle owl, the Eurasian eagle owl, which is kind of awesome creature that would rip your face off if it came anywhere near you. It's the world's biggest owl, although we could argue about that, but it's probably pretty close to being the world's biggest owl. So I wanted to find out about all these British species, and then actually, people started sending me, when you say you're interested in owls, people start sending you owl stuff. The owl merchandising is terrible, and people started sending me information on European owls. There was a pygmy owl. I'd never heard of the pygmy owl. I thought, I've got to go and see that owl. And then I heard about David's trip to this weird place in Serbia where hundreds of long-eared owls come and roost within the city every night in winter. And it wasn't just a few, it was like, is it 800 owls or something have been counted, David, something like that?
Well, in one of the places, Kikinda, in the town square, upwards of 800 owls have been counted in their day roost, yeah. It's like looking into a Harry Potter set.
Yeah. It's like standing under a Christmas tree that's been overdone quite a lot, you know, looking out and all these eyes looking down at you. So anyway, I found out about this trip that David leads to Serbia to see these winter roosts of these incredible birds, because long-eared owls are normally solitary, but in winter they have communal roosts. And in this country, you might see 5 or maybe 6 if you're really lucky. You know, you probably wouldn't even see 1, however, because they're so difficult to see because they roost really in deep thickets. So anyway, I got curious about all these different owls. Someone's got their owl hat on from Kikinda, I can see. And yeah, so I decided all 13 species of European owl were then kind of within my sights. And so I travelled to Finland to see eagle owls, and to Switzerland and France to see pygmy owls, and down to Spain to see eagle owls, and back up to Norway. I travelled all over the British Isles just to kind of bring back the story of these creatures. But it wasn't just about encounter and the kind of the science of owls this time, like it was in Otter Country. It was also about the stories we've enfolded this animal in, you know, the owl mythology, the owl folklore. Why is this creature being covered in so much story? And I wanted to kind of unwrap that a little bit. But at the same time, just as I started the story, my son got very ill, and he was 19 at the time and had been at college. And he developed suddenly, out of the blue, he developed seizures, and we didn't know what it was. And I thought, well, either I can, you know, stop writing and look after him, or I can write him into the story. And we went out bird watching together, and we went out owl watching together, and this seemed to, you know, help him. This would be a healthy, restorative thing to do, even though he was quite unwell. And so I wrote Benji, my son's story, into the book, and that became part of the narrative. So there was much more of a personal aspect to this book, which was a kind of family drama. And things got very difficult, you know, and I thought, how much of this can I say in the book? You know, it's a book about owls. But I thought, I always tell my creative writing students at university to be honest and reveal stuff and not worry and kind of write into the fire, you know, and take risks. And so I did. And so it became a very different book from my first book, which was a study of a search for a species. Owl Sense was also a study of you know, our connection to owls, but also a family in crisis, and how the owl search kind of helped and hindered. Yeah, so it's a very different book, that one.
And I hope this is not a spoiler for those that haven't read it, but did you manage to see all the owls?
No, I didn't. I think I saw all of them, but the snowy owl and the great grey owl, which I really desperately wanted to see. I didn't get to see a great grey owl, but I think I saw all the rest. So I'm still, you know, those are still on my list. So it's not over.
Yeah, they're on my list too, actually, by the way.
Yeah, well, I've already identified a couple of tours, you know, because I think sometimes you need to get these creatures are so elusive, and great grey owls live, you know, either in the wilds in North America or nearer to us in Scandinavia, and so, you know, you really need to get someone who knows where they are to take you. You save an awful lot of time, so I'll probably get taken.
So you said earlier that you kind of got very obsessed with otters, and you just got out there in your camper van and went off on your own looking for otters and staying out, you know, probably in some weird places waiting for otters to appear. And similarly with this last book, you were out exploring. What is it like? What was it like as a woman to do that?
Well, I was less nervous when I was young. I mean, I was writing Otter Country in 2009, and I kind of had a very kind of slapdash attitude, and wasn't nervous at all. I was so determined to get my work done and my otters seen that I didn't worry. But people said to me, you know, I got back and people said, you went on your own? It was that surprised me, actually, because I thought, yeah, because actually you're more likely to be in danger in the middle of town or in your own home. I mean, more women get hurt and injured and murdered in their own homes than anywhere else. So actually, realistically, there wasn't anything to fit. So in my first book, you know, apart from spraining my ankle or something like that, I just didn't worry. And then with Owl Sense, I became a little bit more conservative and kind of went with other people more. So like David, I came to Serbia with you, and I made sure when I went to Finland that I had someone. I got taken, I mean, I got taken by a lumberjack into the woods to see eagle owls. But I didn't really want to wander off into the tiger forest on my own because my survival skills aren't that good. So I mean, it's useful being a woman because in some ways people don't see you as a threat, and it means you can get into places that you wouldn't normally go to. I noticed that I had a really nice pair of binoculars, my Leica binoculars, which cost almost as much as my car, and I'd be trespassing somewhere, and you know, the local kind of warden would come up and he'd see my binoculars and he was about to say, "Oi, get off my land," and he'd look at my binoculars and he'd go, and he'd say, you know, have you seen the you know, the snipe, you know, over there or something, and so, you know, there were advantages and disadvantages, but I was a bit more nervous about going places on my own with Owl Sense. I think I just felt a little bit more vulnerable. I can't run as fast as I used to.
What made you change though? Why did you feel more vulnerable now? Why?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. I think maybe as we get older, we as women we get somewhat out in the wild. We get a little bit less confident, but maybe that's just personal. Other women, it might be different. They might get more kind of rebellious and defiant, you know. But I say rebellious and defiant. There's this strange attitude that it's dangerous as a woman to go off, and a lot of women reported to me that we don't go off on our own because we're too scared. And how did you do it? Well, I just went. And it's so unlikely that anything bad will happen to you that it's probably worth ignoring that. My advice to people is usually just, well, go with a friend, but, you know, don't let your gender stop you. But I think it's kind of considered to be a risk, but looking logically at it, it's not as much of a risk. You're going and doing these things as a woman, not at all.
Yeah, Claire just said there it's a bit of an age thing, she thinks.
Yeah, I think it might be.
You've written 2 well-received, incredible books that obviously have touched a lot of people. What do you think you have offered people generally yourself? What do you think? What impact have you made on people? Do you think?
That's a really good question. In some ways, I mean, I think a lot of writers will say this. In some ways, it's not for me to say. I can only say, I can't say what I've offered people. I can say what I wanted to offer, which was an experience of how it feels to get close and to be curious to get close to these creatures, whether it's otters or owls or whatever animal it is you're after seeing and encountering and learning more about. I wanted to just take my readers by the hand into this world and show them the possibilities and share my curiosity, hoping that it would be infectious and it would engender sympathy, enjoyment, and inspire people to go out really and encounter these creatures and learn more about them. And it's about storytelling and bringing people into your experience, I think. It's about sharing experience. And I hope also that it's given permission, given people permission and ideas of, what they can do and where they can go and what there is to see.
Good. Zoomers, any questions? Okay. I was going to also ask you about what you do now, because obviously as a writer, you're a writer, but you also teach creative writing at Plymouth University. Again, for those, because what I like to do, I like to ask very innocent questions, not assuming knowledge. So for those who don't know what creative writing is, what do you actually teach?
So creative writing is about learning how to make your stories engaging and readable. So a lot of my students come along and they don't really know how to formulate a story. Some of them don't actually know how to formulate a sentence. So it's about the nuts and bolts of making yourself understood and then making yourself engaging and producing stories that will affect people, fascinate them, interesting, grip them. So we learn how to make our writing useful, enjoyable, interesting. Because it sounds obvious that people would be able to do that, but they can't necessarily. Even if they're good readers, they're not necessarily at the start good writers. So by looking at kind of really interesting, inspiring texts of poetry and journalism and fiction and non-fiction, we look at storytelling and how it works, and then have a go at writing our own. And I think creative writing is all about experimenting and finding out what works and what doesn't work. And students learn, that it's only really by getting it wrong and having feedback in workshops and then perfecting or changing or rewriting what we've done that we really can succeed in making our writing work, making it work and making it affect people.
Do you think you can practice creative writing even in a minute form, like writing a text or, writing a short note? Does it start there, or is it always something that's bigger than that?
No, it starts anywhere. It can start with, writing an email, writing a text, writing a little article, a diary, a Facebook post. And I've noticed during lockdown, people are starting to get really creative with what they're writing about. People are writing about their experiences of the things they've noticed and seen in lockdown, because there hasn't been much else to do. So people have started writing more, and particularly writing about the natural world, which has been wonderful. People have started looking out their windows and kind of thinking, what is there to look at? Oh yes, the birds are my colleagues now. I'm looking out my office window, which is my bedroom, and my colleagues are all the birds. And wow, the magpies really had a spat with the jackdaws today, and small things suddenly become really exciting and useful material to write about. So yeah, it can start really small, and then some of my students want to go on and write novels. Not all of them necessarily succeed, but it's great to have a go. It's all good practice.
I'd say that singing, I think certainly singing, and I can't remember what the other thing is, but there's two things things that you're born with that everyone can do. Everyone can sing, apparently. Do you think it's the same for writing? Do you think that writing is natural, that for some reasons drummed out of us as we get older?
probably, I mean, I think storytelling is natural and wanting to communicate is natural. There are all sorts of reasons why people can't or don't write. But certainly, you know, it's what makes us human. We are storytelling creatures, and we want to put our point of view or our experience or our knowledge or our joke or whatever it is. We want to put that across and share it. And I think that's perhaps what makes us different from other non-human species. Although bees tell each other stories, don't they? I mean, bees do their bee dance, and that's a form of storytelling, because they're saying, you know, you need to go that way. And that's where the good honey is, or pollen, whichever it is. Yeah. But yeah, no, we're storytellers, and I think, yeah, like singing, it's just a natural instinct.
Yeah. It's interesting because, you know, I think about what people do in the world. So in our genre, in the nature world, as it were, in conservation, I've seen a lot of people who seem so kind of focused on their own genre, and their influences are people within their own genre. And for me, for example, my main influences are not necessarily people that are nature people. You know, I remember being at the Country Farm Roadshow once in Oxfordshire, Blenheim Castle, Blenheim Palace.
Blenheim Palace, yeah.
And I was on stage with Simon King, and they were asking us both, you know, who are our influences? And Simon went first and said, "Oh, my influence is David, i.e. David Attenborough." I met him when I was 9 years old, blah, 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 blah. And then it came to me, and I said, well, my influences are George Best and Prince. Because for me, it's a much bigger thing you take from other areas. Yeah. So when it comes to you, are you influenced by writers way outside of the genre?
Kate Bush, definitely, because she just did her thing. I mean, she was just totally herself, is totally herself, you know, and transports people to, you know, to other places inside her mind and without. So definitely someone like Kate Bush is an influence. I don't know. I think apart from Kate Bush, definitely my dog is a great role model, you know, just being enthusiastic about everything. You know, he's just happy for every day to begin, you know. So animals, actually, I really identify with. So certain musicians probably, but animals really kind of draw my attention, and, you know, the way birds are with each other. And I had some chickens, and the chickens were so sociable and conversational and kind of, I don't know, it's just the things kind of nearby influenced me. So maybe other writers. I mean, I was vastly influenced by Henry Williamson as a child, as a storyteller. And current nature writers I love are Mark Cocker, whose title, Crow Country, I stole for Otter Country, who said that was okay, by the way, when I asked him. And there's another writer, Tim D, who was, you probably know Tim, a radio producer, but really interested in poetry and also writes beautiful prose. And the poets, Ted Hughes and Seamus Heaney. So there's a great mix of influences. Like you, David, it's not just writers and books. It's, you know, other kind of richer influences, music, poetry, other people. You know, my dad, my granddad, my mum. She wrote poetry. She does still write poetry. My brother's really into politics, and he's an activist, you know. So all these kind of influence, I think, make us who we are as writers.
So we're going through a very strange time in our lives with the COVID-19 pandemic. How have you found lockdown? How, you know, has it sort of spurred your creativity, or have you spent it?
I've hardly written a thing, and I think it was just the fear and the pressure as well. Like, oh great, you know, I'm at home, I've got all this time, so I haven't been very creative. I've written what I had to write, which was my nature notebooks at the Times. I do a kind of regular column at the Times on, you know, seasonal stuff month by month. And so I have written my nature notebook and really enjoyed that. But that was because I had to. You don't, you know, not submit your piece for the editor of the Times. So that's probably the only. I've written a couple of poems. But apart from that, I've kind of lurched from being extremely happy and contented in my house. So I've got my daughter here, and my partner here, and my dog. So very kind of actually feeling very safe and loving my garden. I've got a vegetable patch now, and we've done some DIY. I think with half the country, you know, we've got vegetable patches, and considered getting chickens. So I've been really domesticated and just kind of hunkered down. I haven't been bored. I wouldn't say I've ever been bored, but I'm lucky. I've got a garden, and I live in Devon, and I can just walk out of my house. Although I live in suburbia, I can walk out of my house and go to the Devon lanes. But I haven't really felt very restricted. I haven't minded not being able to get to the shops. I've quite enjoyed that, actually. So I've been quite contented, you know, in all the drama and fear and kind of horror of it. I found a place of kind of peacefulness and just kind of patience and waiting, you know, waiting for it to be over. And one of the things that's kept me going is work, though. I mean, the teaching at the university has been quite demanding because we've had to transform all our lectures and seminars online. So that's been, and learn Zoom, and so that's been, the technology has been quite a challenge at first. But no, I think I've been okay.
I mean, I've been speaking to a lot of people. I'm marooned in Spain on my own, so I've been in contact with a lot of people in the UK and elsewhere. And some of those people have been saying, you know, I've had this idea all my life, I'm going to do it now. But it doesn't happen. But what advice would you give to someone who has never written anything before, really, and suddenly decided, you know what, I've spent 3 months sort of, you know, in this unusual situation, I've got time on my hands. What advice would you give them to sort of get cracking?
Yeah, just get on with it. Don't worry. I think people worry, you know, is this worth it? Is it any good? That's the most awful, crushing censor that you could possibly give yourself. So just get on with it. Write anything, whether it's poetry, whether it's the novel you always wanted to write, or your memoir. Just write it down and don't throw it away. Keep it and sit on it, because often we write stuff and then immediately we think, oh, that's terrible, I can't show it to anyone. Just leave it a couple of weeks or a couple of months, and you'll come back to it and think, well, actually that's quite good. But don't show it to anyone. You know, people say the most awful things. They either say, oh, that's lovely, darling, or they're really critical, and that's very kind of crushing. So yeah, don't show it to anyone. Just get on with it. Don't worry, and take risks, and be honest, and be experimental, you know. And your fascinations, whatever they are going to be fascinating to other people. Whether it's, you know, you're actually fascinated with newts, or, you know, or nuns in the 17th century, or whatever it might be, it's going to be, fascination is infectious. If I've learned anything, it's that. So yeah, just get on with it and follow your passion and your fascination and see where it takes you.
Wise words, Miriam. Anyone out there, any Zoomer would like to ask a question? Don't be shy.
Liz is waving her hand.
Okay, Liz. Liz, let's hear you.
You have to unmute yourself.
Hello, Miriam.
Hello, Liz.
Nice to see you. I really enjoyed the poetry school course that we did. And I just wondered if you had any sort of more projects coming up. Are you likely to publish any more poetry or anything else?
Well, at the moment, I'm planning to do an anthology of my nature notebooks, which are really popular. I get lots of really nice feedback online and from the Times. And this is a kind of monthly look at what's going on in and around Devon, in the hedges and woods and rivers and so on. And that's a seasonal kind of diary, which is quite a lyrical, sensory kind of way into the world. And I'm gonna, my agent has already said she's interested, my publisher is quite interested, so I might do that. That might be the next thing, kind of knocking those into shape and getting those out as an anthology. So that's the nature notebooks.
Great.
And I've got, I mean, I was going to go around the world looking for albatrosses, because I got, a year or so ago, I got really, really fascinated with albatrosses, which is dangerous because once I get fascinated, I can't stop. But I met a new man and he said, would you be going away for long periods of time? And I said, possibly. And he said, oh, please don't. And actually, I've been so happy and in domestic bliss that at the moment I've kind of lost the urge to go to South Georgia, especially with the sea crossing.
Yeah.
So David, I know you've been down to the southern Atlantic. Have you? Down to Chile, was it? You've been.
I've been to Antarctica and I've crossed the dreaded Drake Passage four times now.
Yeah. I can hear the clap for the NHS going on out there. Can you hear it too? So yeah, I do have another idea up my sleeve, which is very much set in Britain, another aspect of Britain. So I'm starting to cogitate on this, but I'm not going to share it. It's really under wraps because I don't want to jinx it or give away my idea. But it's a very eccentric and quirky look at a particular aspect of the British Isles.
Sounds like you, Miriam.
Yeah.
Thank you, Liz. Now, Miriam, let me ask you, what is your favourite bird?
Do you know what, David? This changes. I'm a bit disloyal when it comes to birds. I really absolutely love kingfishers. And I've been watching, there's a kingfisher nest that I found on the River Dart. And I find these birds, they're so elusive and you could blink and miss them. And it's like a kind of electric bolt of blue going up the river. And people get very excited about seeing them. So I absolutely love kingfishers. And I love that watery kind of whistle they make when they dart past you on the river. And you always hear them before you see them as well. So I love that. It's another kind of watery creature, a bit like, I saw quite a few of them when I was looking for otters. So I think, today it might be the kingfisher, but I also really, really love lapwings. That lovely kind of whistly noise they make and the beautiful crest and iridescent plumage. And they are so rare now, where I live anyway. They're not common at all and difficult to see. I used to see them a lot when I was a child in Sussex. So I kind of long for lapwings, but I think kingfishers might be my favourite at the moment.
And your favourite mammal, would that be a surprise?
Oh, it's got to be the otter. They're just the best. They're the best at being otters. They could rip your face off if they wanted to, but most of the time they see you coming, so you never see them. They've got the best bite of all the mammal kingdom for their size. You know, they've got the densest fur of any mammal per square centimetre. They've got webbed feet. They've got a tail that they can steer with. They made this amazing comeback after being nearly eliminated by us. I think otters are the best.
Sounds like a good reason. And your favourite plant?
I really, really like foxgloves. I collected a whole load of foxglove seeds from the woods, and I scattered them a few years ago in my garden. And this year I've got like a forest of, and they've got the way bees just disappear into them. I mean, have you seen that? They just kind of disappear inside and then come back, and you can just sit there and watch the bumblebees. I just love foxgloves, and that bright purple. Goodness me, I love that colour as well. Really vivid. Foxgloves.
And if you could be anywhere in this world, notwithstanding the current pandemic, where would you be right now?
I know where that would be. I would be somewhere I used to live, actually, which is the Isles of Scilly, which is a kind of tiny island paradise in the Atlantic, about 28 miles off Land's End. Peaceful, blue sea, dolphins, orca, subtropical plants. Peaceful. I go to the Isles of Scilly. In fact, I booked a holiday there for next month and can't go because of the lockdown, but I'll be back when I can.
Yeah, beautiful. Just to let you guys know that coming up in the In Conservation With series with me, tomorrow night we have Stephen Moss, the famous producer, or ex-producer now, from the BBC, and he'll be talking about nature writing actually as well. He writes a book every 2 minutes, so I'm sure whilst we're talking, he probably would have written and finished one as we were going through the interview. And on Sunday we've got Tim Appleton, who is the godfather of all bird fairs. And so I hope that you can join us on those two. And there's more coming, but not set up in terms of dates yet. So at this point, I'd like to say to Miriam, thank you very much for sparing your evening to come and talk to us about your work and about your thoughts. It's been really enjoyable. And
thank you, I've enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's been really great to see you as well. And all you guys, all you Zoomers, thank you so much for attending. Please keep safe and all that sort of stuff still. And don't forget to keep looking up.
Yeah, keep looking up.